Chapter 8. Jamie Races to the Edge.
I'm sure Stoic didn't mean you have to watch over them literally at all times. What are they going to do? Burn the village down? Funny coming from you. You're more suspicious than any of us. Except maybe my dad.
It was hard to see in the late sunset, but Astrid definitely rolled her eyes. They were out on the evening flight, like Hiccup had promised Toothless. Astrid had seen him getting ready and had decided to join. Hiccup had no reason to refuse. He had a lot on his mind, and he knew Astrid did as well. That, and he also enjoyed her company, obviously.
It's true,
Hiccup said defensively.
I'm not saying it's a bad thing, just... I'm not more suspicious than you. You're just too polite to be open about it, Astrid quipped. And no, you're right, it's not a bad thing. We should be careful. Maybe even more careful than we already are. You just said they wouldn't do any harm while I'm gone. I said they wouldn't burn the village down. I didn't say they wouldn't do something else. They're just kids, Astrid. Kids that we know nothing about. I know that, but...
Hiccup sighed, shaking his head. There really was no point in arguing. Not because Astrid was stubborn, or that they were both stubborn, but because Hiccup did actually agree with her. He understood her point of view, but still...
I know. I don't trust them either, but there's just nothing about them that screams distrustful.
Astrid felt silent. She was frowning, gazing downwards. Then she pointed.
There,
she said, and Hiccup followed her gaze to a small island, halfway hidden beneath a cloud layer.
There's no dragons on that one, right?
Hiccup shook his head, and they flew down there. The island was so small it barely counted as an island at all, and therefore it didn't have a name either. It was more like a big rock in the middle of the ocean, with just enough width to grow a charming little forest. Astrid dismounted Stormfly, petting her gratefully. Hiccup did the same, and as he and Astrid went to sit down at the root of a huge pine, Toothless and Stormfly trotted off together. Astrid pulled out a bundle from her bag, containing today's dinner, mutton chops. Just like 2 days before, and then the day before that again. Hiccup didn't complain out loud, and took a chop when Astrid handed it to him.
I'm guessing Jack and Jamie still didn't join the rest of the village for dinner, since we're here,
Astrid said, taking a bite out of her mutton chop. She frowned.
It tastes a little less like earth this time.
Hiccup wasn't sure if he agreed, but he hummed as if he thought it was delicious.
Nope,
he said in between chews.
After our tour, they seemed pretty exhausted. Can't really blame them. They probably weren't prepared for any dragon trouble, or snot-loud trouble.
Dragon trouble?
Yeah, Gustav and the other kids. It was weird, though.
Hiccup lowered the mutton chop, looking over at Toothless and Stormfly, who were having a light-hearted play fight.
Fanghook acted strange when Jack intervened. I can't explain how he did it, but he made Fanghook back off.
Astrid's eyebrows were knitted tightly together.
From the boy who's never seen a dragon before,
she asked. Hiccup knew what she was thinking. He'd had the idea as well.
You think he's lying?
He asked. Astrid shrugged.
Maybe, she said.
Probably. Hiccup bit the inside of his cheek. The mutton chop, which wasn't very appetizing in the first place, didn't seem so tempting anymore.
What about the kid? He asked. He's just 11. How can he be a threat to us? Maybe that's what they want you to think. Who are they?
Astrid sighed, leaning heavily against the tree trunk.
I don't know, Hiccup,
she said, and brought a hand to rub on her forehead.
I'm not saying they're definitely dangerous. I want to believe they aren't. No, I want to know they aren't. Believing is not enough. And if they aren't?
Hiccup asked. Astrid sent him a questioning look.
We have to help them get home, he continued. I don't think they can do it alone. If they truly don't know anything about dragons, they can't be from the archipelago. They'll get themselves killed.
Astrid averted her eyes.
You're probably right, she said. But let's focus on one thing at a time. Keep them close by until we know we can trust them.
Hiccup held back a tired sigh. He knew she was right.
When will that be, though?
He mumbled. It was a rhetorical question, but Astrid answered it anyway.
When we know them.
She tapped her finger restlessly against her knee, looking intently at the mutton chop, as if that was the key to unlocking all of Jack and Jamie's secrets.
So what do we do now?
She then asked. She looked at Hiccup again. Assuming everything they've told us is true.
We know that neither of them has any memories of how they got to Berg, Hiccup said.
Which is very convenient for them, but go on. Hiccup sent her a look before continuing.
Jack is 17 and Jamie is 11. None of them have seen dragons before. I'm pretty sure they didn't even know they existed, judging by their reactions. Jack knows how to fight, but I don't know to what extent. He knocked Snotlout on the floor, apparently.
He hummed thoughtfully.
He also thinks Snotlout is fun, which is weird in itself, but then again, at least we know for sure that Jack is a bit funny himself.
Astrid snorted.
You can definitely say that, she said. When I came to wake him earlier today, he completely spaced out on me, like he completely forgot that I was there. And then, when he turned around, I don't know, something scared him? It was weird.
She shook her head before she continued speaking with a more serious tone.
They told me they come from a place called America. No, they told me the language they speak is English and America is where that language is from. If they're from that place, I don't know for sure.
Observant, Hiccup commented.
Jack told me they learned Norse from traders visiting their village, she continued. But that it had been a while. They didn't seem to know Trader Johann, but who knows? I think it's a bit strange that they speak so fluently, if that's the way they learned it. They sound almost native, hadn't it been for their accents. You think they fake the accents? Hiccup asked.
Astrid pursed her lips, then shook her head.
It seems consistent, even Jamie's, so unless he's a very talented actor for a little kid, it seems real to me. So you're suggesting they learned it another way, Hiccup concluded. There's something they aren't telling us. There's definitely something they aren't telling us. If it's a story of how they learned Norse, I don't know. But yes, I think Jack lied about that.
That was definitely a huge warning sign.
Something else, too, Astrid murmured. She was looking at the darkening sky now. They didn't know about the gods. In a moment, I thought to just ask which god Gothi prayed to specifically, but I'm starting to think maybe they didn't know about them at all. They'd have to be living under a rock, right? If their goal is to trick us and blend in, then that's definitely a weird detail to add to their false personas, Hiccup said. And then there's the other thing about shoes. What's so funny about shoes? I don't understand, Astrid muttered. It sounded like she was talking mostly to herself now. And how did he just know Jamie was waking up last night? He didn't even check first, but he knew somehow. Doesn't make any sense. And the staff, why did he carry the staff? It looks like it can break any moment, so how can he use it to knock Snotlout, who's considerably heavier, to the ground? What? Hold on, Hiccup said. Astrid looked a bit annoyed at being interrupted, but Hiccup just sent her an inquisitive look. I never said Jack used his staff specifically. Astrid blinked. Hiccup couldn't see in the darkness, but he imagined color spreading on her cheeks. You didn't? Must have assumed, Astrid. Oh, all right, Astrid grumbled. I was following you. Hiccup stared at her. The whole day? Astrid opened her mouth as if to argue, but then just shrugged in defeat. I just want to figure them out, she said. Hiccup sighed, but decided he wasn't in the mood to argue about that. He took another bite of his mutton chop. So how much did you see? He asked. All of it, Astrid said. Well, almost. I didn't get very close when you were sitting with Fishlegs, but I did see the whole ordeal with Fanghook and then what Jack did to Snotlout in the forge. Then she sent Hiccup a look. I also saw you were speaking to Gobber. What was the thing you were showing him? It was Hiccup's turn to look guilty. Oh, that's nothing, I think, he mumbled. Astrid raised a brow, and that was all it took for him to relent. He got up and called for Toothless. After retrieving the stone from the satchel, he sat back down with Astrid, holding the stone up to her. It's some kind of crystal, but I've never seen anything like it. Gobber didn't know either. I found it nearby the spot where we found Jack and Jamie. Astrid's eyes went big with wonder when she looked at it. She touched it carefully. It's beautiful, she muttered, her brows furrowed. Do you think it's theirs? Hiccup shrugged. Maybe. Why didn't you give it to them then? I felt like it was... There was a faint sound behind them, so faint Hiccup almost thought he imagined it.
Still, it was enough to make him stop talking and strain his ears. Astrid looked confused, but tilted her head to listen as well.
"What is it?"
she whispered.
Hiccup didn't immediately answer. "I'm not..."
He started, but cut himself off again. It sounded almost like movement. A few meters away, Toothless and Stormfly were still busy with their play fighting, and it didn't seem like they had heard anything. Maybe the darkness was just playing tricks on him, but Hiccup carefully got to his feet. Astrid followed his lead. Carefully, Hiccup walked around the pine tree, peering into the darkness of the small forest. He held his hand on his sword hilt, inching forward.
"Hiccup, what is it?"
Astrid asked again. There it was again, though Hiccup couldn't identify the noise. It was a bit like wind in his ears, but subtler, softer.
"Anybody there?" Hiccup called out. "I can hear you."
Astrid's eyes started from Hiccup to the darkness and back. She looked lost.
"I don't hear anything," she whispered. "What are you?"
Hiccup held a finger to his lips, and she went quiet. They stood in silence for several seconds, not moving a muscle. Even Toothless and Stormfly seemed to have gone quiet out in the clearing. He didn't hear anything now, but he had the distinct feeling that someone was watching them in the shadows, waiting. A wind blew through the trees, making the leaves stir. A chill went down his spine when Hiccup thought he heard something in the breeze. A whisper, almost? At that moment, he was keenly aware of two things: the weight of the crystal in his hand, and that there was something on this island after all. Hiccup didn't know what, but it didn't feel friendly. He looked at Astrid, and she seemed to read his thoughts. She nodded, and they headed back to Toothless and Stormfly. They could eat the rest of their dinner back on Berg. As Hiccup mounted Toothless, he felt those eyes on him again. He looked behind himself, sure that he would see something lurking between the trees, but saw nothing but darkness. Maybe it just was the darkness that scared him after all. If not, and there truly was something hiding in there, he could go back tomorrow and check it out, when the sun was shining. Yeah, that sounded like a much better plan. I mean, it's definitely the worst thing I've ever tasted, but at least it seems to work its magic, Jack was saying, eyeing Gothi's soup with a half-hearted smile on his face. Oh, what do you think? Do you feel better? Jamie nodded, but he was also giving his own bowl of soup a glower.
Is it worth it, though?
He mumbled miserably. Jack opened his mouth as if to say something encouraging, but then just closed it with a resigned smile. After departing with Hiccup and Toothless sometime before dinner, Jamie and Jack had made the trip back to Gothi's hut. If they hadn't already been tired from their tour, they definitely were when they got back to the top of the mountain. Jack had been cracking jokes the whole way up, complaining that he was old and not accustomed to using his legs. It was funny, but Jamie did his best to pretend he didn't notice the slight defeated look that was making its way into Jack's face. It was impossible to imagine how weird this must be for him, and it seemed he didn't want to talk about it either. That was fine. Jamie wasn't going to push him, even if he was curious. Meanwhile, Jamie's own body wasn't doing much better. He was used to being active and playing outside, but to be fair, he was still recovering from that cold. The fact that they had traveled through time apparently didn't do anything to change that, and the path to Gothi's hut was the most challenging hill he'd ever climbed. He'd almost convinced himself he'd completely recovered, but when they finally collapsed on Gothi's balcony, he took it back. He definitely needed a few more days of rest. When they'd gone inside the hut, they found a nice little surprise from Gothi. Well, the surprise in itself didn't make Jamie super happy, but the way it had been given definitely did. Gothi had left them a note. None of them understood her writing, but she had taken that into account, because beside the note was a small doodle of two stick figures. One tall stick man holding a crooked staff, and a shorter one standing beside him. The two stick figures were both holding the two bowls that were waiting for them. Jack liked the drawing so much he'd put it in his pockets, along with Jamie's drawing. And now they were here, several hours later, still gathering the courage to actually drink the soup. Baby Tooth chirped at them. Easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to drink it, Jack replied with a mumble. Jack smiled amusedly. Then he straightened his back and took a deep breath. Okay, he said dramatically. See you on the flip side. He drank the soup. Jack raised his brows, but now that Jamie had taken the first step, he seemed to find the courage to do the same. That was a win for himself, Jamie thought smugly, and used that as motivation to finish the soup first. A few minutes later, they put the empty bowls on the table and huddled back under the furs beside the hearth. It was late and Jamie's body felt heavy with drowsiness. Jack didn't look much better, the rings under his eyes seemed darker than usual, and he wasn't very talkative. Still, when Jamie lay down, Jack remained sitting upright.
"Aren't you going to sleep?"
Jamie asked.
"Soon,"
Jack said with a tired smile. Jamie studied him for a few seconds.
"You don't have to wait for me to fall asleep, you know,"
he said. It seemed he'd hit bullseye because Jack's smile faltered just a little.
"I know,"
he said, "but it feels better. Makes me sleep easier." Jamie frowned, but decided not to question it. He made himself as comfortable as possible on the fur skin. Sleep was already pulling him to unconsciousness, but he forced himself to keep his eyes open, just for a little bit longer.
"It was fun today,"
he murmured. "It sure was eventful," Jack agreed.
"Even if I got attacked by a dragon, I'm glad Baby Tooth was there to distract him."
Jack fell silent. Jamie got a feeling he'd said something wrong, and he looked up to see Jack studying his staff, as if he'd just noticed a stain or something.
"Jack?"
Jack met his eyes. He tried for a smile, but it was stiff. Hiccup and the others seemed confused. "Maybe we should be more careful," he said. He sounded off, somehow. Jamie bit the inside of his cheek.
"Is something wrong?"
he asked tentatively. Something was wrong, Jamie could already tell, from the way Jack didn't immediately answer, and something about the way his eyes were directed at Jamie, like they were begging to be averted. Or maybe Jamie was just so used to seeing Jack happy and confident, everything else felt like doomsday. It hurt to admit, but Jamie didn't know Jack enough to be certain. Jack sighed, almost soundless. "It was a close call," he said softly. "I should have been there."
"But you were," Jamie said. "You were right in front of me."
Jack opened his mouth, but then closed it again. He seemed to be weighing his words. "I have to figure out the dragons," he said. "Things like that can't happen. I'm sorry, Jamie." Jamie sat up again, sending Jack an exasperated look.
"It's not your fault," he said, almost indignantly. "It was that other kid's fault. Gustav or whatever. He was showing off."
"Yeah, but..."
"And then I tried to touch Fangok's nose, like I'd done with Toothless, but he wasn't having it, I guess. You couldn't have known that would happen."
"No, but..."
"And Hiccup was there. He knows how to handle dragons, so..."
"It's not Hiccup's job to protect you, it's mine." Jamie's voice caught in his throat as Jack's voice. He didn't sound angry, exactly, not irritated or annoyed, but there was something else. Something stern and serious. It reminded Jamie of running through the streets of Burgess with Santa, the Tooth Fairy, and the Easter Bunny, while Jack was in the sky fighting Pitch.
"Get Jamie out of here,"
Jack had said, in the same way he'd spoken just now. Jack's face softened just a second later. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jamie beat him to it.
"I know," he said, "but you don't have your powers. You can't blame yourself for not being able to control a dragon. It's a dragon."
Jack's expression was hard to read. Jamie glanced at Baby Tooth. She looked worried, but when she caught Jamie's eyes, she tweeted in agreement at Jack. There were a few more seconds of silence before Jack nodded faintly. "You're right," he said, "but I am still a guardian, and I promised I'd get you home."
"And you will," Jamie said, and smiled. "Don't worry so much, Jack. It doesn't suit you."
Jack laughed at that. "Thanks," he said. "I'll try not to. Let's go to sleep, all right? It's very late." Jamie didn't feel like protesting. He lay back down with a weary sigh.
"You sleep too," he mumbled to Jack.
"I will," Jack said. "Good night, Jamie."
"Good night, Jack. And Baby Tooth?"
Baby Tooth chirped. It almost sounded like a laugh. Jamie couldn't remember dreaming anything before he woke up again. He wasn't sure what exactly had woken him up, but all of a sudden his eyes shut open. It was dark and quiet. The fire in the hearth had died, and the candles had been blown out. He couldn't hear anything except for the faint snoring of Gothi's Gronkle in the other room, or maybe that was Gothi. He wasn't sure. Carefully, he pushed himself up and looked around. Across from him, Jack was curled up on his fur skin, unmoving. Jamie could barely see his blankets rising and falling. It took him a few seconds to realize why the sight weirded him out. He'd never seen Jack sleep before. He couldn't see his face, and with only his brown hair in sight, the only thing suggesting that it was Jack lying there was his staff, which Jack still held, even in his sleep. Jamie quietly pushed the covers off himself and got to his feet. The floorboards barely creaked under his weight, and it was easy to sneak around Jack without waking him up. Jamie crouched in front of him. He didn't know why, but he wanted to look at his face, like he needed to reassure himself that it truly was Jack. Jack's sleeping expression reminded Jamie of those nights he'd stayed up with Sophie, trying to catch the Tooth Fairy in action, or even Santa Claus on Christmas morning. Obviously, they'd never succeeded, but Sophie had always been the first to fall asleep. Jamie usually followed about half an hour later. It was boring to wait without her. Despite all her overflowing energy, Sophie always looked relaxed and peaceful when she slept. Almost no sign of life at all, as if all the day's activity had left her completely exhausted. Jamie supposed it was always all or nothing with Sophie. Even sleeping, when finally unconscious, she was really unconscious and almost impossible to wake up. Maybe Jack was the same. Jamie wondered if he had even needed sleep back when he was a spirit. If not, he wondered if it was weird for him to get tired, or if it was scary to close his eyes. Jamie had sometimes had that fear. What if he went to sleep and then just never woke up again? A soft chirp made Jamie look away from Jack's face and over to his shoulder, where Baby Tooth had appeared. Jamie realized he'd never given it any thought what Baby Tooth did while he and Jack were asleep. Did tooth fairies need sleep? If so, it made more sense that they were nocturnal, since they needed the night to collect teeth. But since she always seemed to be awake, no matter what time of day, Jamie supposed she didn't need any sleep. She was looking at Jamie questioningly, tilting her head to the side. "I just woke up," Jamie replied in a soft whisper, not wanting to wake Jack. "I'll go back to sleep." He cut himself off when he heard a soft shuffle outside, making both him and Baby Tooth freeze. He thought he heard something, a whisper. Was someone outside? Jamie exchanged a look with Baby Tooth and slowly got to his feet. Baby Tooth chirped warily. Jamie contemplated waking Jack after all, but then he heard something else. A giggle, followed by urgent shushing. Jamie's heart was beating anxiously, so he didn't know what compelled him to walk towards the door. Baby Tooth followed, tweeting quiet protests, but Jamie didn't listen. He crept towards the door and put his ear against it. He heard muffled voices, multiple voices. They were whispering to each other, but Jamie couldn't make out what they were saying. He could, however, make out that these voices didn't belong to any grown-ups. He opened the door. "Better not to do it, then," a girl's voice was saying, but she cut herself off when she spotted Jamie. There were 3 people standing on Gothi's balcony, all 3 of them children Jamie had seen in the Dragon Arena yesterday. He didn't know their names because he'd never really gotten the chance to speak while they were with them. They'd been asking too many questions, and Jamie got no opening to answer any of them, much less to ask questions himself. There was a blonde boy, a heavy-built girl that reminded Jamie of Cupcake, and another kid with short black hair that Jamie couldn't determine whether it was a girl or a boy. Jamie swallowed down his nervousness. "Hello," he said quietly. Jack hadn't made any sound behind him, so he assumed he was still dreaming. The big girl exchanged looks with her friends. The boy didn't react much, but the third kid smiled lopsidedly. The big girl spoke first. "You're awake," she said. Jamie raised his brows. "Yeah," was all he could think to answer. The girl nodded to her right. "Want to come with us?" she asked, offering no explanation for why they were creeping outside Gothi's hut. "It's the middle of the night," Jamie said. "What are you doing?" "It's almost daybreak, actually," the boy said. "We agreed to sneak out to meet you. Properly, I mean." Definitely dubious. Jamie didn't know what to answer. The third kid raised their brows, smirking at him. "Scared?" they asked. Jamie felt his self-preservation all but crumble. No matter the time period, humans had apparently always been the same, and the "scared" challenge wasn't any less impossible to turn down when coming from a group of Viking kids. He scowled at them. "Of some kids randomly creeping outside my door in the middle of the night?" he asked back, and continued before the other boy could correct him again. "In your dreams." Baby Tooth tweeted in protest beside him, and Jamie sent her a look. "Come with me, then," he said. It took him a second to realize why he shouldn't talk to the invisible fairy in front of the other kids. The kids were all giving him strange looks. The boy sent the big girl a confused glance, while the third kid snorted.
"He's crazy," they said.
"I'm not crazy," Jamie protested, and then winced when he realized he'd raised his voice. He glanced behind himself. Jack shifted in his sleep. His staff scraped slightly against the floor. They were all dead quiet for a few seconds. Jamie turned back to the kids to see them trying to look over his shoulder. "Is he sleeping?" the boy asked. Jamie grabbed his shoes by the door and stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "Yes," he said. "Normal people usually do at this time." "Wouldn't exactly call him normal," the big girl said, earning a giggle from the third kid. Jamie scowled. He wanted to defend Jack, but found that he didn't actually have the courage to stand up to these kids. The sarcasm just now had come as a surprise. His mother wouldn't have liked that kind of talk. "Whatever," the boy said. "Let's go before he realizes you're gone." Jamie stepped into his shoes. He was already wearing his jacket. He'd barely taken it off since they'd gotten here and slept with it during the night because of the cold. Baby Tooth protested again, but Jamie ignored her as he followed the other kids down the stairs. He did manage to send her a slightly apologetic look, though. "Where are you going?" Jamie asked. "The woods," the big girl said. Jamie almost stopped walking. "The woods? Why are you going there?" The big girl grinned at him. "Because we can. Don't worry, nobody will know." Jamie wasn't sure if that was good news for him or not. They continued down the hill. The grass was wet and slippery, and Jamie almost fell on his butt on multiple occasions. That would have been embarrassing. As they passed a boulder, the big girl suddenly stopped and crouched. She picked something up, hidden behind the stone. It was hard to see what it was in the darkness. Jamie squinted at it before a small gasp escaped him, making the other kids look at him. "What? Never seen a bow before?" the big girl asked with a sly smirk. She picked something else up, a quiver of arrows, and hoisted it over her shoulder. Jamie stared incredulously at her. "How did you get that?" he asked. "It's my dad's." "He gave that to you?" The big girl laughed. "Gave it to me? Of course not. I'll put it back where I found it before he knows it was even gone." She waved at them to continue walking. "He won't notice a few arrows missing either." Jamie didn't want to ask, both because he was afraid of the answer and because he didn't want to seem clueless, but he had to. "Why would you need a weapon?" The others gave him strange looks. "Wherever it is you're from, you're not telling me you can just walk around without any way to defend yourself," the boy said. "Are you?" Jamie glanced at Baby Tooth unthinkingly, but she was of no help. Even if she'd answered, Jamie wouldn't have been able to understand her. He looked back at the boy, who was raising his brows at him. "Normally, yeah," he replied vaguely. The androgynous kid wrinkled their nose. "Sounds like a horribly boring place." "It's not," Jamie protested. He almost couldn't believe what he was hearing. These people were crazy. "It's not boring just because we don't have to defend ourselves against, dragons or whatever." He paused. "Even if I do wish we had dragons," he then added. "There aren't many wild dragons left on Berg, I think," the boy said, but his voice was partially drowned out when the androgynous kid said, "You really don't have dragons?" Jamie shook his head. "I've heard of him," he then said, wondering if this was actually something he should tell them. Maybe he'd mess up the timeline or something, like the butterfly effect, which he'd seen even though his mom told him not to. He still had nightmares about it sometimes. "I just didn't think they existed." The kids all laughed, as if that was absolutely ridiculous. Jamie pretended his cheeks didn't feel hot, and he still wanted to discuss the bow and arrows and what they were going to use them for, but decided to let the matter go for now. They were probably just going to practice shooting. On inanimate targets, hopefully. "Jack never told us where you were from," the big girl said. "Yes, he did," the boy argued. They're from Burgess, right?" "Burgess," Jamie corrected, holding back a laugh at the way he said it. Still, there was a small twinge of pain in his chest. It had only been a couple of days, but it felt like weeks since anybody had mentioned his home. The fact that these Vikings now knew about the name of that city, even though Burgess didn't even exist yet, Jamie swallowed, deciding not to think too hard about it. It made his head spin. "Burgess," the boy said again. It still sounded weird, but better this time. Jamie decided to take a small leap.
I don't actually know any of your names, he said, a bit sheepishly. Sorry if you said it earlier. A lot was happening at once.
The boy and the big girl both seemed thoughtful, but the androgynous kid was harder to read. I'm Brand, the boy then said. He didn't offer his hand, and Jamie stuffed his own hand in his pocket to mask the fact that he'd been expecting him to. He then gestured to the big girl. This is Andis, and that's Hrafnildur. Jamie blinked.
Andis?
Undis, Andis said with a nod.
Why is that funny? No reason, Jamie said. And what was it? Hrafnildur? Hrafnildur said.
That didn't really answer the question if they were a girl or a boy. The name sounded like some kind of ancient wizard spell.
Hilda for short,
Hrafnildur then added, and Jamie was relieved to see them smile. It seemed they didn't take offense at Jamie's inability to pronounce their name.
Hildur,
Jamie repeated. That was a bit easier. Anders and Brand.
Sounds about right,
Brand said with an amused smile.
All right, guys,
Anders said, lowering her voice.
We're getting close. We'll have to sneak through the village.
Who's on patrol tonight? Brand asked.
I only know Astrid is,
Hildur said.
But she's about the only one who matters. You know Astrid, Jamie?
Jamie hesitated.
The tall blonde one, right?
You gotta be more specific than that, Brand said. She kinda looks like she could kill you just by glaring at you. Jamie slowly nodded.
Yeah, that's the one, he said. What will she do if she catches us?
The silence scared him more than any answer would. Hilda was the first to speak.
Let's not worry about that, they said. Nothing will happen as long as we don't get caught.
That's reassuring, Jamie said, while Baby Tooth gave a mournful chirp. Anders held up a hand.
Shut up, she whispered. From now on, don't speak. Follow me.
Baby Tooth tried one last time to convince Jamie to go back, but Jamie just sent her a helpless look, as if he had no choice. And he didn't. He didn't know for how long they were going to stay in the past, but either way, Jamie was the new kid. He had to prove himself to the others in order to fit in. And he would explain that to Baby Tooth, but if the goal was to fit in, then talking to her wasn't a very good idea. It felt wrong, but he had to ignore her for now. Jamie followed Andis and the other kids. Hilda was close behind Andis, their eyes flickering watchfully around as they silently ran into the village. Brand was behind Jamie, and Jamie got the uncomfortable feeling that he was blocking an easy escape. They ran from hiding place to hiding place, behind houses, water troughs and wagons, and everything else that was big enough to hide 4 children whenever a guard came walking past. Jamie already knew that Berg had been through some difficult times, and seeing these guards walk around on night patrol made him even more curious about what exactly had happened. It wasn't until they'd almost made it through the entire village that Jamie had another thought. If he really had been some kind of bad guy whose mission was to infiltrate Berg, then these kids weren't being very smart by trusting him just like that. Unless... Jamie came to a sudden stop, and Brand almost walked into him.
What are you doing? He demanded.
Hurry up.
Yeah, sorry,
Jamie said, and tentatively started walking again. Unless these kids actually didn't trust him, and they were leading him into the woods into the middle of the night, without anybody knowing he was even gone.
Maybe this isn't such a good idea, Jamie tried.
Anders sent him an unimpressed look.
Thought you said you weren't scared, she said. I'm not, it's just, what's the point of going into the woods? Aren't there, like, bears or other animals in there? Well, duh, Anders held up her bow. What do you think this is for? Target practice?
Jamie didn't answer. He exchanged looks with Baby Tooth, but kept his mouth shut. Maybe he could get to talk to her once Brand wasn't walking so closely behind him. But it seemed Brand was determined to not give Jamie any opening to do anything suspicious. Jamie swallowed. This was a bad idea. He'd known it was a bad idea from the start, but only now did he actually register how bad this idea was. The forest was dark. Jamie didn't know if it was darker than any other forest he'd been in, like the woods outside Burgess, but it certainly felt like it was right now. As they walked further into it, Jamie came to the chilling realization that the woods had been the last thing he'd seen of Burgess. Hopefully this trip into the forest would be a little more peaceful than the last one. It was quiet. The loudest sound was their footsteps, but they didn't hide the faint creaks in the darkness. Jamie blamed it on the wind, making the leaves rustle and the branches groan, even if the wind didn't seem very strong today. He was almost too tense to speak, but eventually he couldn't help it.
So, do you know where you're going, or are we just walking? Far enough away from the village so they won't hear us,
Hilda replied, sending Jamie a grin. Jamie swallowed.
Okay,
he said slowly. Brand came up to walk beside him. Hey, he said, and smiled in a way that was a lot more inviting than the elfish look Hilda was sending him.
You must have gone through a lot to get here. Scarier things than walking through a dark forest, right?
I'm not scared, Jamie immediately replied. Anders and Hilda laughed. All right, Brand said, but it was clear he wasn't convinced. But still, tell us, why are you here? Jamie hesitated. He was about to give a vague answer, like Jack had been doing this whole time, but then realized something else. He frowned at Brand.
That's why you brought me out here, he said. To question me?
Brand shrugged. Everyone's wondering, but nobody's doing anything about it, he said. Never got an answer out of either of you yesterday.
You good talkers,
Hilda said, walking backwards to look at Jamie while they spoke.
It's a very suspicious skill to have in your situation. But if you gave us a proper answer, then maybe we don't have to go around forging stories and spreading rumors. You could just not do that, Jamie suggested. Didn't even notice we hadn't gotten any answers by the time you and Jack ran off with Hiccup,
Brand said, with a shake of his head.
Why? Do you have something to hide?
Jamie's heart was beating faster. He shoved his hands into his pocket to stop himself from fidgeting.
Not really, he said. I don't remember how we came here. Neither of us do. Sure you don't,
Anders muttered.
It's true, Jamie insisted. Roughnut and Toughnut said you were cursed, Brand said. That's why you appeared in that blizzard.
That made Jamie's chest twinge uncomfortably. Of course, he already knew that winter in itself wasn't necessarily good or evil. Jack had told him once that he wasn't in control of all winter, but that his duty was to bring fun and happiness into the season of cold and darkness. Astrid had called Berg's winters harsh. Devastating winter, she'd said. Obviously, winter wasn't a beloved season here on Berg. The thought seemed almost absurd to Jamie at this point, to think that these kids thought they were cursed just because they'd appeared in a snowstorm.
That's stupid, Jamie concluded. Cursed how? Dunno. By the Snow Queen, I guess, Brand said. Don't ask me, it was Rough and Tough who said it. The Snow Queen? Jack repeated.
He glanced at Baby Tooth, but she just shrugged.
The spirit who brings devastating winter,
Hilda said, still with that elfish look in their eyes. Jamie got the feeling that they were intentionally trying to scare him.
They say she tries every year to chase us Bergians off this island, but we're too stubborn. Besides, the dragons were always a greater problem than the climate, Brand added. But she's eventually accepted that we're not going anywhere, Hilda continued. She doesn't like outsiders, though.
Jamie swallowed.
That's not true, he said,
but even as the words left him, he felt bad. Not because he was scared, but because he didn't want this to be another Who's Jack Frost situation.
Maybe the winters are so harsh she's trying to protect you,
Anders snorted.
It's just a story, she said. Nobody actually believes it. But you believe in gods? Jamie challenged.
All three kids sent him bewildered looks.
Obviously that's not the same, Brand said. You shouldn't compare the gods to old stories made to scare little kids.
He sounded genuinely alarmed, as if he was afraid Thor would strike him down any moment. Jamie decided not to argue. Who was he to say that the gods weren't real? Still, he wouldn't just stand around letting the Snow Queen, or whichever spirits lived around here, get framed as a villain.
How do you know the Snow Queen doesn't exist? Jamie asked. If you believe in curses and trolls, what makes her any different? Well, to start off, nobody's ever seen any Snow Queen, Anders said.
Jamie took a deep breath. This was his forte, he felt.
Sometimes you have to believe in it before you can see it, he said matter-of-factly. Trust me.
Baby Tooth chirped, but Jamie didn't catch the tone of her voice. She was either moved or sad or wary, or maybe something else. He couldn't look at her to check. Hilda squinted at him.
You believe in the Snow Queen, they said.
Jamie shrugged.
I haven't heard of her before. Then why do you sound so sure? Because
Jamie stopped himself. Was this something these kids should know about? Or would it mess up the future, like in the movies? Then again, what would the words of a little boy mean to these kids? And also, if they so happen to believe him, they'd believe in things, in people that deserve to be believed in. What was so bad about that? The kids were staring at him, waiting for him to continue.
Where I'm from, there's a legend about someone called...
He hesitated again. A name popped up in his head, a little different from what he had intended to say, because it seemed safer in case he truly would mess up the timeline like in the butterfly effect.
Jokel Frosty, the spirit of winter.
Jokel Frosty? Brant repeated.
That's Norse? I thought you said you weren't from here.
Jamie hesitated, then shrugged.
Maybe he's from here originally, he said, and traders brought a story to us. Well, I've never heard of that story, Anders said. What's so special about Jokel Frosty?
Jamie straightened his back.
I've seen him, he said.
Anders and Hildur laughed.
Yeah, right,
Brant said. Blood rushed to Jamie's face.
It's true, he said,
and was surprised to hear anger in his voice. Then he realized he was angry. These guys couldn't really be blamed for not knowing a story like that. Jamie hadn't believed in Jack Frost at first either. But still, he didn't want to go through all of this again. He'd already done that last Easter. Or he was going to do it in like a century or whatever. Point was, he was angry anyway.
Uh-huh,
said Anders, crossing her arms.
What did Jokel Frosty look like then?
She said the name with such mockery in her voice, Jamie balled his hands into fists inside his pockets.
He has white hair and blue eyes, he said, no hesitation this time, and clothes that are covered with frost. He looks like a teenager, but he's much older than that, I think. I'm not sure how much older, but he's immortal.
All three kids were giving him dubious looks. Hildur scoffed quietly.
You really are a good talker, they said. Or maybe you just actually do believe in this.
Jamie gritted his teeth.
And you believe in a lightning god and that the earth is... Shut up,
Hildur interrupted. The voice was so sharp, Jamie immediately understood that this had nothing to do with the argument. He did as they said and watched as they stared into the darkness, unmoving. Immediately, all his previous worries about what might be living in these woods came flooding back, momentarily forgotten in his desperation to convince the other kids of Jack Frost's existence. Anders and Brand were also completely quiet. Baby Tooth had flown closer to Jamie and landed on his shoulder. Jamie didn't know if she was trying to hide or to protect him. Several long seconds passed. All Jamie could hear were their breathing, the sound of his own heartbeat, the trees creaking, and the faintest rushing of what might be the ocean in the distance. Nothing happened for so long, Jamie was about to ask what they were all listening for, and then he also heard it. Quiet, creeping footsteps, twigs snapping and bushes rustling. Something was coming towards them. Then followed a sound Jamie knew he would be having nightmares about several months from now on. A thin sort of growl. No, not a growl, a prolonged, hair-raising grunt. Pig? Jamie whispered unthinkingly. The snorting stopped. Anders sent him a sharp look, silently telling him to shut up. Slowly, she reached behind herself and pulled out an arrow. As quietly as she possibly could, she knocked the arrow and aimed. Jamie held his breath. The footsteps were coming closer. Anders waited. There was a blood-curdling squeal. Jamie staggered, stumbling backwards into a tree as he heard the pig gallop towards them. He couldn't see where it was coming from in the darkness, and unless these Vikings had some kind of night vision that the history books had failed to mention, he seriously doubted Anders' aiming would be any good. She was literally taking a shot in the dark. The arrow shot into the bushes. The furious squealing did not stop.
"Run!"
Anders bellowed. Jamie didn't need to be told twice. All four of them shot off into different directions, just as the pig emerged from the bushes. Jamie dived away from the tree without sparing any time to see who the pig decided to go after, and was glad that he did. The pig slammed into the tree a second later. If Jamie had still been standing there... All Jamie got to see of the pig was a huge, dark, bulging mass of fur. The pig wasn't like those lazy farm pigs that Jamie thought of when he heard the word pig. In fact, he was starting to realize this wasn't a pig at all. It was a wild boar. Baby Tooth was tweeting at him in panic, desperately tugging at his hair. Jamie scrambled to his feet while the pig was dazed and set off into a wild sprint. The path back to the village was all but forgotten. It didn't matter that he wasn't following it. All that mattered was that he was putting distance between himself and that beast. The boar squealed behind him, sounding angrier than ever. If it didn't have a reason to kill Jamie before, the humiliation of crashing into the tree seemed enough incentive. Jamie tried to be quiet so as to not alert the boar, but he couldn't make his running away any quieter, and when he tripped over a tree root, landing face first in the mud, he couldn't help but cry out. The boar's hoofs were trampling towards Jamie at a tremendous speed. It was only one boar, yet it sounded like a stampede. Jamie pushed himself up and jumped behind the tree just in time. The boar fright trained past him, quickly pushing its hind legs into the earth to change course. Jamie ran. There was nothing else he could do. He could climb a tree, but he didn't have the time. He could call for help, but Hilda had clearly told him that they were outside the hearing range of the village. The sun had yet to rise. He was alone. And then he saw it, an opening between the trees with the faintest of light filtering through, the dim sky of a dawn on the brink of breaking. Jamie's breath almost left him, but he shouted at the top of his lungs, "Help!" The boar was closing in on him. "Help!" The village was so close. Someone had to hear him. Jack, Astrid, anyone, and then he realized he wasn't running towards the village. There were no houses, no dragon arena. There was nothing. Literally nothing. A cliff. Jamie tried to stop, but it was too late. He stumbled over his own feet and toppled over the edge. For a split second, Jamie stared down at the ocean below, dark and unforgiving. He shut his eyes, and once again, he fell.